Welcome to the virtualization unit. In this unit, the three major topics that we intend to cover are file systems, virtual memory, and virtual machines. Let's get started with an introduction to virtualization. So what is virtualization? Virtualization refers to the act of creating a virtual as opposed to actual version of something, including the virtual computer hardware platforms, storage devices, and computer network resources. Here is another definition. Virtualization is a layer mapping its visible interface and resources onto the interface and resources of the underlying layer or system on which it is actually implemented. So why would we want to use virtualization? So there are various reasons. First is abstraction. So essentially, virtualization simplifies the use of the underlying resources. So for example, by removing the details of the resources inherent structure. As a simple example, you can think of the file system interface presented by our operating systems as a virtualization of the actual storage devices attached to our computers. Note that because of this file system interface, you do not have to worry about the low level details. For example, exactly what kind of hard disk is attached to your computer. Is it a SSD? Is it a magnetic hard disk? Is it a tape drive? Also, you do not have to worry about the details like how the data is actually stored on your hard disk. Is it stored contiguously? Is it spread across various different non-contiguous blocks in the hard disk, and so forth? Further, you do not have to worry about exactly how to store the data on, let's say, a SSD versus a magnetic hard disk, how to retrieve the data from an SSD or a magnetic hard disk or a tape drive for reading. The file system interface abstracts away all of these details from you. So this is one important advantage of virtualization, which is abstraction. The next advantage here is replication. Replication means to create multiple instances of the same resource. This basically helps allocation and management of the resource across several processes and competing users. So some examples of this would be, let's say, mouse and keyboards. So physically most computers have a single mouse and a single keyboard, but logically each process has its own mouse and keyboard. A GUI application program just uses event handlers to respond to what appears to be its own mouse and keyboard. Another example of this would be processors or the CPUs. So physically a machine may have just one CPU. Let's assume a machine has a unicore uniprocessor machine. So the processor can only execute one program at a time. But most modern operating systems support the appearance of executing several programs simultaneously. So each instance of the program is called a process, as we know. Though several processes may be executing, their logical view is that they have the processor all to themselves. Similarly, displays or our monitor screens. So physically most computers have only one display device. However, most operating systems allow several processes to access this display simultaneously. So each process uses a logical display called a window. And finally, virtualization also provides isolation between users and processes. So isolation is used to separate how different clients or different processes make use of the underlying resources, perhaps simultaneously. So this might help, for example, to improve security. So for example, on a same physical hardware, different virtual machines could be running, and different virtual machine could be assigned to a different user or a different client, so that they do not interfere with each other's processes, they do not access each other's data. So this provides enhanced security. Note that these various virtual machines may be simultaneously running on the same physical hardware. So with that quick introduction to virtualization, we are now ready to dive into the file system virtualization in our systems. Alright, so what is a file? So you would know that computers can store information on various different types of storage media, for example SSDs or magnetic disks or maybe optical disks or magnetic tapes. Now given all of this variety, the computer systems need to be convenient to use, and therefore operating systems provide a uniform logical view of the information that is stored on the secondary storage regardless of what storage medium is used. And therefore the operating system defines a file as a logical storage unit to abstract from the physical properties of its storage devices. So the logical file is essentially the programmer's view of the storage. So for example, the programmer may view a file as a contiguous stream of bytes stored somewhere on some secondary storage. As opposed to this, the physical file, which is the actual file on the storage device, this may not actually be stored contiguously as viewed by the programmer. So for example, if this is your hard disk, let's say it is possible that some portions, let's say this file is actually fragmented and spread across this hard disk. So it is possible that let's say the first block is stored somewhere here, the second block is stored here, the third block is stored over here. Now it is the responsibility of the operating system to map this logical view of the programmer onto the actual physical storage of the data or the file. Please note that this is a very simple high level example for illustrative purposes, because for example if you had a real hard disk here, a magnetic hard disk has spinning disks, it has sectors and so forth, which are not shown over here. In general, a file is really a sequence or a stream of bytes, bits, lines or records, the meaning of which is defined by the file's creator and user. For most practical purposes, operating system does not care about the formatting of the file except in some specific cases. For example, in case of executable files, these files have a predefined format or structure. So operating system is expecting the executable files to be in this expected format so that it can find the information necessary for executing the process or program. Similarly, the information is also stored in some expected format inside the directories. But for most part, besides these cases, the operating system does not care about formatting of data inside files. Note that files or a logical file is a very powerful abstraction for a stream of bytes. A logical file need not always represent an actual file of data which is stored on, let's say, some storage device. A file, for example, could represent a stream of data coming from a console input, or a stream of data that is coming from the network or some other IO devices. It could also represent output coming from another process. In Unix based operating systems, the files abstraction is used to additionally interface with input output resources, for example pipes or network sockets and so forth. The main advantage of doing this for us users is that we can use the same old familiar and convenient interface to deal with a variety of different data sources. So we can use the same familiar interface of, let's say, open, close, read, write, to communicate with a variety of data sources, including the IO devices as well. The file system resides on secondary storage devices, for example SSDs or the hard disks. It provides an efficient and convenient access to our storage devices. As we have seen, it provides a user interface to the storage devices which actually maps our convenient logical representation or logical view of our data to their actual physical locations on the disk. So recall that we as users typically tend to view that all the data inside a file is stored contiguously at the same place somewhere in our hard disk. However, as we have seen, this could actually be fragmented and maybe partitioned and spread across various different locations inside the hard disk. So it is the job of the file system to map this convenient view that we have onto the actual physical location of this data on the storage devices or the hard disks in our systems. The disks that we use, they have two important properties that make them suitable for secondary storage. So first is they can be rewritten in place. Now this is true for magnetic hard disks, but for SSDs there is some overhead for rewriting the block in place, but it's not too much overall. And the second important property is that our SSDs and hard disks, magnetic disks, they provide random access or direct access. So essentially any block of data in our disk can be accessed with minor delays pretty much in case of magnetic disks, and in SSDs it is pretty quick. Also, it is important for you to remember that when we are transferring data between the hard disk and the main memory, this transfer typically is not done in bytes or bits. This happens in units of blocks, and each block is typically 512 bytes or 1 kilobyte or 2 kilobyte or 4 kilobyte, or it could be larger as well depending on the system. You can visualize the disk as an array of several blocks, perhaps thousands of blocks or hundreds of thousands of blocks. Now some space on the hard disk is reserved for or devoted for managing the files, the file system itself. So for example, for keeping track of the directory structure, where different files are located, what blocks in the hard disk are already used, what are free, and so forth. The file system itself is organized into layers. Here is an illustration of the layered file system. At the lowest layer here we have the actual storage devices. So for example, our SSDs or the magnetic hard disks, these go over here. So the storage devices along with the storage media and any other controls that are connected to them, they all belong here in this lowest layer of the devices. The IO control layer, this is an interface to the actual hardware. So it's, in this case, for example, it would be an interface to the SSD or the magnetic hard disk connected to our computer system. It consists of device drivers. Now device drivers are special software programs which are often written in assembly language. Now these device drivers can communicate with the devices, the hardware devices, directly by reading and writing special codes directly into the devices, the storage devices ports. Next we have this basic file system level. Now this level works directly with the device drivers for retrieving and storing raw blocks of data onto the hard disk. Now this level or this layer does not have any consideration for what is actually stored within each block. Now recall that hard disk is divided into several blocks. Depending on the system, different blocks may be referred to with either a single block number, for example 1 2 3 4 5 6, or they can also be referred to with a combination of head, sector, cylinder combination, especially if you have a magnetic hard disk. So let's say this is our hard disk and this is divided into several blocks, right? So each of these blocks will have a number. Let's say this is 1 2 3 and so on, right? So and somewhere here, let's say we have this block number 1 2 3 4 5 6. So at this level, at the basic file system level, this block number refers to an actual physical block on the hard disk. So let's say if you here we say read this block number, then the data stored here in this block 1 2 3 4 5 6, this would be retrieved. Next we have this file organization module. So this module knows about the files and their logical blocks and how these logical blocks inside the file map onto the physical blocks on the disk. So for example, let's say we have a file called foo.txt, and this file, let's say it's a very small file which has only 3 blocks of data, let's say 1 2 and 3. Now note that these 1 2 and 3, these are the logical block numbers which the user views. However, on the physical disk, these logical blocks number 1 2 and 3 from foo.txt may be stored on very different physical block numbers. So for example, it is possible that this block number 1 is actually stored on 1 2 3 4 5 6, this physical block number. This block number 2 is, let's say, stored on block number 1 2 3 4 5 7, right? And assuming contiguous allocation, they don't have to be allocated contiguously. And let's say this is 1 2 3 4 5 8. So this file organization module is responsible for translating these logical block numbers inside our files to the actual corresponding physical block numbers where those are stored on the hard disk. In addition to translating from logical to physical blocks, the file organization module is also responsible for maintaining the list of free blocks and allocating these free blocks to the files as needed. Above this we have the logical file system, which is responsible for the programmer's view of the file system via system calls. So this layer basically manages the directory structure. So the logical file system deals with all of the metadata associated with the file. So for example, who is the owner of this file, when the file was created, what are the permissions, and so forth. So everything about the file except the data itself, that is here. This level manages the directory structure and the mapping of the file names to the file control blocks. Now these file control blocks, or FCBs, they contain all of the metadata as well as block number information for finding the data on the disk. And above this logical file system level, we have our application programs running the user programs. So before moving on to the file system allocation methods, I must point out that a layered approach to file systems means that much of the code for the file system can be used uniformly for a wide variety of different file systems, and only certain layers need to be file system specific. Some examples of common file systems are Unix file system. Linux typically supports the extended file system, so we have ext2, ext3. There are many other file systems that are supported by Linux. For Windows we have the FAT32, NTFS file systems. So there are many other file systems. These are some common ones. So with that, we are now ready to start talking about the allocation methods which are used in different file systems. Typically, many files are stored on the same disk. Now the main problem here is that how to allocate space to these files so that the disk space is utilized effectively and the files can be accessed efficiently or quickly. So this is the problem that is solved using file system allocation. An allocation method basically refers to how disk blocks are allocated for files. Now here is a list of various file allocation methods that we'll discuss in this course. So we'll start with contiguous allocation, then talk about linked allocation, file allocation table, indexed allocation, and finally multi-level indexed allocation. Throughout this discussion, remember that the granularity at which hard disk is accessed is a block. It is not a byte or a word. Recall that a block is it could be, let's say, 512 bytes to 2 kilobytes or 4 kilobytes or 8 kilobytes or more depending on the system. So we would be visualizing the hard disk as an array, a very large array of blocks. So the first allocation method here is contiguous allocation. As the name implies, in contiguous allocation, every file occupies a set of contiguous blocks on the disk. So here is the logical model of our hard disk. So note that we have a hard disk and we are visualizing this as a stream or an array of several blocks. So these are blocks, right? Block 0, 1, 2, 3 and so on up to block number 31. So these are several blocks in this hard disk. Now if we are using contiguous allocation, every file would be allocated a set of contiguous blocks on the disk. So for example, we have this file name count. So this file has two blocks, block 0 and 1, which are contiguous. Similarly, let's say this other file f, this is allocated these two contiguous blocks 6 and 7. Likewise, let's say we have this third file here tr, it is allocated contiguous blocks 14, 15, 16. Likewise, this file list is allocated contiguous blocks 28, 29, 30, 31 on the disk. Therefore, in contiguous allocation, the directory entry for each file indicates two things. So it will have the address of the starting block number, the starting block of the file, and the total number of blocks or length that is allocated for this file, as shown here, right? So let's say so there are these in this directory entry. As you can see, we have the file name and then the starting block number and the length of the file in terms of number of blocks. So for example, file count, as we have seen here, it has the starting address of this file is block number 0, so that is shown here, and then the length of this file is 2 blocks, so only 2 blocks 0 and 1 were allocated. Similarly, if you look for file tr, note that it starts at block number 14, so that's the starting address here, and it has 14, 15, 16, 3 blocks, right? So that's why the length is 3, and so forth for all other files. So this is a simple way of allocating blocks to files, and it supports both sequential as well as random accesses for the files. So for sequential access, the file system would remember the disk address of the last block that was referenced, and when necessary it will read the next block. So sequential accesses are simple. Random access or direct accesses are also supported. So let's assume we have a file like this. This is contiguously allocated and it has several blocks 0, 1, 2, 3 and so on. So note that this 0, 1, 2, 3, these are logical block numbers, right? And let's assume that this file starts, the first block of this file allocation starts at address B. This is the physical block number, the actual physical block on the hard disk. So inside this file, if you want to access, let's say directly access ith block number I. Now this is the logical block number. So in contiguous allocation, we know that the address of this logical block I inside the file would simply be B plus I. So this can directly be accessed, and therefore both the sequential and random accesses are supported. In general, contiguous allocation results in good performance for both sequential and random accesses, mainly because the adjacent blocks inside the file are also located adjacently on the hard disk or on the physical medium. Despite its simplicity, contiguous allocation has several issues. Now the first problem over here is typically you need to know the size of the file at the time of allocation. Because in contiguous allocation, if the file grows, there may not be room on the spot to allow the file to grow. You may need to find another space, another contiguous larger space for the file if it grows. So for instance, let's assume we have a hard disk which is 10 GB in space or size. The shaded spots here, they indicate the space that is already occupied, and the blank spots, this is the space that can be used for new allocation. Now let's assume there is a new incoming file which requires 1 GB. So we decide to allocate it here in this available 1 GB chunk. Later on, if this file needs to grow, note that this space is pretty tight. There is no room for this file to grow here on the spot. So if this file were to grow from, let's say, 1 GB to, let's say, 1.5 GB, we will need to move this file to a bigger spot, let's say here. So resizing a file requires a reallocation of the entire file, which is an additional overhead and cumbersome. Now another problem here is fragmentation. So over time, by addition and deletion of files, the hard disk space may get fragmented across several small chunks of blocks, which in total may have the capacity to accommodate an incoming file, but because they are not contiguously located, they cannot be used for allocating a new file. So for instance, going back to this example over here, in this hard disk right now we have a total of 4 GB of space which is free. So we have 2 GB here and 2 GB of free space over here. Now let's say there is a new incoming file that requires 3 GB of space. Now with contiguous allocation, even though in this hard disk we do have 4 GB of free space, none of this free 4 GB is contiguous, right? So we have 2 GB here and 2 GB here. So none of these 2 GB chunks can accommodate the 3 GB incoming file contiguously. Now this is specifically an example of external fragmentation. There is also internal fragmentation, which we will talk about separately. So external fragmentation, it exists whenever in total in the hard disk we have capacity to house an incoming request. However, the largest contiguous chunk that is available is insufficient for this new incoming request or file. We can address this problem of fragmentation, external fragmentation, using compaction. So in short, what compaction does is it will move all these allocated files together to one end of the hard disk, so that we create a large contiguous free chunk of space at the other end of the hard disk. So for instance, what we can do is we can copy the entire file system onto another disk. Now the original disk is completely free, creating one large contiguous free space. Now we can copy back the files onto the original disk by allocating contiguous space to all the files from this one large hole. So this scheme will effectively compact all the free space into one contiguous space, let's say at the end of the disk. So this will solve the external fragmentation problem. However, note that the compaction comes at the price of time. It takes a lot of time and overhead. It can be particularly severe for large hard disks. The third problem with contiguous allocation is how do we figure out where is the best place to put a new incoming file. So in general, three strategies exist: first fit, best fit, and worst fit. Let's take an example to understand how these work. So let's assume we have this hard disk, and I have modified the previous example. Let's assume now it has a total of 11 gigabyte of space. Again, the shaded portions show the occupied space and the unshaded portions are the free chunks. Now here we have three chunks here. First one is 2 gigabytes, second one is 1 gigabyte, and the third one is 3 gigabyte. So let's assume we have a new incoming file which requires 1 gigabyte of space. So what the first fit would do in this case, first fit would start searching the disk from the beginning, and the first chunk it can find which is big enough or large enough to accommodate the incoming request, the incoming file would be allocated there. So in this case, for example, this 2 gigabytes chunk, this is big enough. This is the first chunk that is big enough to accommodate this 1 gigabyte incoming file. So it would be allocated here by the first fit algorithm. As opposed to this, the best fit strategy says that we should find the chunk, the smallest chunk that is big enough to house the incoming request. So for instance, in this case, 2 GB, 1 GB, 3 GB, all three of these chunks can accommodate the incoming file. However, the smallest of these that can accommodate the incoming file is this chunk of 1 GB. So the best fit would accommodate or allocate this incoming request here in the 1 GB chunk. And finally, the worst fit is basically opposite of best fit. It says that we should use the largest chunk which can accommodate the incoming request. So in this case, for example, according to worst fit, we should use this largest chunk which is of 3 GB to accommodate the incoming request. In general, first fit and best fit, these are most common strategies that are used to select a free hole or chunk from the set of available chunks or holes. Experiments have shown that both first fit and best fit are more efficient as compared to worst fit in terms of time and storage utilization. However, neither first fit nor best fit is clearly best in terms of storage utilization, but first fit is generally faster. Next is linked allocation. Linked allocation solves all the problems of contiguous allocation. In linked allocation, each file is represented using a linked list of disk blocks. Essentially, each block contains a pointer to the next block on the file. The good thing is the blocks do not need to be contiguous. The blocks can be scattered anywhere on the hard disk. If a file grows and you want to add more more space to the file, you just need to append another block, and appending to a file is the same as adding to the end of a linked list. So any free block located anywhere in the hard disk can be appended at the end of this linked list. Now, although the blocks do not need to be contiguous in this allocation, ideally the blocks would be placed close to each other on the hard disk if possible, so as to improve access speeds. So each block basically looks like this. It has a pointer to the next block and the remaining space for the data item. Again, this next block would also have a pointer to the subsequent block and some data item and so forth. The directory entry in a linked allocation is simple. It just contains a pointer to the start and the end block of the file. The intermediate blocks are not stored in the directory. Each block contains a pointer to the next block. So basically, from the directory we can come to the starting block. From here we can look at the pointer and get to the second block. From the second block we can look at the address of the third block and so forth. So note that each block contains a pointer to the next block, and these pointers are not made available to the user. So for example, if the block size is 512 bytes and let's say the pointer on for the disk address it requires 4 bytes, then the user can only get to use 508 bytes for its data, as shown here. Linked allocation has a number of benefits over contiguous allocation. So for example, in linked allocation, files can easily grow and shrink. Also, there is no external fragmentation in linked allocation, because recall that the blocks do not need to be contiguous, and therefore as long as there is a free block inside the hard disk, it can be appended to the end of any file. However, there are still some drawbacks for linked allocation as well. So for example, fragmentation is not a problem, but because contiguous allocation is not required in linked allocation, but that could affect performance. So for instance, let's assume that we have a rotating hard disk. Now in such hard disk, if you want to access the subsequently next block for the same file, you may have to incur significant amount of rotational and seek latencies. So this would affect the performance. Recall, in contiguous allocation, the subsequent block of the same file would be allocated contiguously on the hard disk, and so this was not an issue. The other problem is the pointers that we are storing inside the blocks, they would also consume some space. So for instance, if each pointer is using 4 bytes and let's say your blocks are 512 bytes, then essentially around 0.78% of your total space is consumed by the pointers. So this space is not available to the users for storing their data. Essentially each file would now require slightly more space than it would otherwise. The third problem here is linked allocation is effective for sequential access. However, if you want to directly access, let's say, some ith block inside this file, then you would have to traverse through this linked list. So essentially you'll have to start at the beginning here at the starting block and traverse through each of these pointers until you reach your desired ith block. Now note that these pointers, these are stored on the hard disk blocks. This is not a linked list in the main memory, and therefore each access to a pointer requires essentially a disk read. Recall that reading from a hard disk is much slower as compared to reading from the main memory or from caches. As a result, it is inefficient to support a direct access or random access capability for linked allocation files. The final problem for disk allocation that is listed over here is reliability. Recall that the linked allocation links the files together through these pointers that are scattered all over the disk. Now consider what would happen if a pointer was lost or damaged, maybe for example because certain blocks of the disk got corrupted. So reliability is a concern. We may lose data this way. There are some possible partial solutions to this problem listed over here. So for example, instead of using singly linked list, use doubly linked lists. The other possibility here is additionally store the file name and relative block number for the files within each block. Storing this additional information can certainly help boost reliability, but note that all of these schemes require additional space or additional overhead for each file. An important variation on linked allocation is the file allocation table or the FAT table. This technique is used by the MS-DOS operating system. The file allocation itself is similar to what happens in the linked allocation, but the main difference is the linked list portion of the blocks is stored in a separate table here called the file allocation table or the FAT table. So the way this works is a section of the disk at the beginning of each volume would be set aside to contain this table. Now this FAT table will have one entry for each disk block, and this would be indexed by the block numbers. So for instance, in your hard disk, if there are a total of n blocks, for every block there will be an entry in this table. So the table entries here would go from block number. So this is block number 0, let's say block number 1, and so on all the way. So this last would be block number n-1. So the table is indexed by these block numbers, but it is used in much the same way as a linked list. So for instance, this is here we have a directory entry of a file named test. So the directory entry for this file will contain the block number of the first block in this file. So in this case it is 217. So if we go to entry number 217 in this table, in this entry here in the table we'll find the block number of the next block in this file. So which is 618 in this case, right? So if we go to entry number 618, here we'll find the block number for the next block in this file, which is 339. So this chain will continue until we reach the end, the last block of the file. So this entry for the last block of the file, let's assume there are only these blocks in this file, so, and 339 is the last block. So the entry for this last block in the table will have a special end of file marker or some end of file value. The blocks in the disk which are unused, those are indicated in this table by a value of 0. So let's say this block number 0 is unused, so this will have a value of 0 in the table. So given this convention, if we want to allocate a new block to a file, we simply need to find an entry in this table that has a 0 value, and then we can just replace the previous end of file value in the last block of the file with this new block, and the 0 in this new block would be replaced by the end of file value or end of file marker. The main advantage of using this file allocation table over linked allocation is that the random access time for accessing, let's say, the ith block inside a file is improved, because here, let's say, once this file allocation table is cached, let's say in the main memory, to find the location of ith block inside a file, we just need to read through this file allocation table. We do not need to go through all the chain of blocks on the hard disk. The next file allocation policy is the indexed allocation. We have seen that if we do not have a FAT table, the linked allocation cannot support efficient direct access because the pointers to the blocks are scattered with the blocks themselves across the disk. Indexed allocation solves this problem by bringing all the pointers together into one location, the index block, which is also known as the inode. So here, essentially each file has its own index block. The index block is an array of disk block addresses. The ith entry in the index block points to the ith block of the file. The directory entry of the file would contain the address of the index block itself. So for example, here, let's say for file Jeep, the index block of this file is block number 19 on this hard disk. So let's say this block over here. So this block 19, which is the index block for file Jeep, will contain an array of disk block addresses for the file Jeep. So if we want to find out where is, let's say, the third block inside this file Jeep, so we simply look at this third entry in the index block, so which is 1. So this means that block number 1 here in the hard disk contains the block number 3 of this file Jeep. Similarly, where is block number 1 of this file Jeep, right? So block number 1 is on block number 9 of the hard disk, so which is over here. So the way this works is, initially when the file is created, all the pointers inside the index block of the file would be set to nil. So in this case, let's say this nil value is represented by these -1s. So right now these pointers are not pointing to any valid block. Now whenever the ith block is first written inside the file, we will obtain one of the free blocks in the disk, and the address of this free block would be put in the ith block entry inside the index block. So index allocation supports direct access or random access. It does not suffer from external fragmentation. Also, the random access times that are exhibited by indexed allocation are better as compared to the linked allocation as well as the file allocation table. And that's mainly because in index allocation, if you want to access the ith block, you directly go read the ith entry inside the index block and you have the target address. As opposed to this, in the linked allocation, you have to follow through the chain of linked list. And also in the file allocation table, even though you don't have to go through several blocks, but you still have to follow through multiple entries in the file allocation table to find the ith block address. And therefore this indexed allocation scheme is faster for random access. However, indexed allocation does have its downsides. For instance, it has this overhead of index blocks. Every file needs to have an index block. Typically, the pointer overhead of the index block is greater than the pointer overhead of linked allocation. So to understand this, let's assume that we have a small file that only contains 3 blocks. Now to store this file, if we were using linked allocation, we would lose a space of only 1 pointer per block. So that is basically just lost a space of 3 pointers. As opposed to this, using indexed allocation, an entire index block must be allocated, even though only 3 pointers would be used and all other pointers in the index block are going to be nils or minus ones. Another thing to consider here is, for large files, one index block may not be sufficient to hold the addresses of all the blocks. So we may need additional index blocks. Now several possibilities exist to address this problem. For example, we can link the index blocks together. So for instance, simply speaking, the first several entries or the first n-1 entries inside an index block could be the addresses of the file blocks. However, for a large file, the last entry in the index block could be the address of the next index block, not a file block. And this may continue in a chain. Another possibility is using some kind of a multi-level indexed allocation. So this is a variant of the linked representation which uses the first level of index blocks to point to a set of second level index blocks. Now these second level index blocks will point to the file blocks. We'll talk more about this later. And finally, a naive solution could be just limit the size of file in the operating system such that it fits within one index block. So let's talk a little bit about multi-level indexed allocation. So like we have seen here, the first level index block or the inode basically points to a set of second level index blocks, not to the file blocks themselves. Now there could be multiple levels of indirections here. So let's assume we have a 2-level table or a 2-level indirection. So in this case, the inode will point to a second level index blocks, and these blocks in the second level, each of these blocks would actually point to the data blocks. So in this case, when we have this 2-level indirection, to access a block, the operating system will first use the first level index to find a second level index block, and then use that block to find the desired data block in the file. Now this scheme can be extended. Higher levels of indirections are possible, 3-level or 4-level indirection. Now the greater is the level of indirection, the greater would be the desired maximum file size supported in the operating system. Note that when we have these multiple levels of indirections, the intermediate index blocks, they would be allocated only as the file grows and when they are needed. So this picture over here illustrates a multi-level indexed allocation for 2 levels of indirection. So this green block over here, this is the first level index node or the inode. Now this inode will have pointers to the second level of index blocks. Note that these blue blocks, they do not contain the actual data. They also contain indexes. Now these blue blocks, these will contain pointers to the actual file blocks or the data blocks, which are these white blocks shown over here. An important thing to note here is this diagram is not drawn to scale. So each of these rectangles you see here, this green rectangle, this blue rectangle, this white rectangle, all of these will have the same size on the hard disk, which is equal to 1 block. So if the block size on the hard disk is 1 kilobyte, each of these green rectangle, the blue rectangle and this white rectangle, they will be 1 kilobyte in size on the hard disk. Alright, so let's work on this class problem. The question is saying, assume that we have a 2-level multi-level indexed allocation as we have seen on the previous slide, and the system is using 1 kilobyte block sizes. So both the index block as well as the data blocks are 1 kilobyte each. Assume that each entry within an index block is 4 bytes. So for this system, what is the largest file size that can be supported? Now the question is saying only count the space that is storing data. So basically we do not need to count the space occupied by index blocks. So recall, this is how our 2-level indexed allocation looks like. This is our first level of inode. This is the second level, and then these over here, these are the data blocks. So the question already tells us that each of these data blocks is 1 kilobyte in size. So essentially all we need to figure out is how many such data blocks would there be that all of these second level index blocks can index together. So let's start from this inode. The question says this inode is also 1 kilobyte and each entry inside this inode is 4 bytes. So how many entries would there be? So the number of entries would be block size divided by the entry size. So the block size is 1 kilobyte. 1 kilobyte, recall, is 2 to the power 10 bytes and the entry size is 4 bytes. 4 is basically 2 square bytes in powers of 2. So this is basically 2 to the power 8 entries. If you do the math, 2 to the power 10 divided by 2 square is 2 to the power 10 minus 2, which is 2 to the power 8. So this original inode here, the first level inode, will point to 2 to the power 8 other inodes in the second level. And note that the question tells us that all the nodes are the same size, right? So each of these index nodes are also 1 kilobyte each, and each entry inside these blocks is also 4 bytes. So with the same logic, using the same computations that we have done here, each of these inodes would also be able to support 2 to the power 8 entries or pointers. So the number of data blocks that we can point to is basically given by the number of second level index blocks multiplied by the number of entries per block. So the number of second level index blocks we have seen is 2 to the power 8 because the original inode here can only support 2 to the power 8 entries. So it can only point to a maximum of 2 to the power 8 second level blocks. So this 2 to the power 8 multiplied by each of these blocks can also, we have seen, only store 2 to the power 8 entries or pointers. So the total number of data blocks that we can point to is 2 to the power 8 into 2 to the power 8, which is 2 to the power 16. So this is the total number of pointers that we can store for the data blocks, but each data block is also 1 kilobyte. So the total size of the file size would be 2 to the power 16 multiplied by size of each block, which is 2 to the power 10 bytes, 1 kilobyte, right? So this is 2 to the power 26 bytes. Recall 2 to the power 26 is basically 2 to the power 6 multiplied by 2 to the power 20. So 2 to the power 6 is 64, and recall 2 to the power 20 is a mega. So this would be 64 megabytes. Now the second part of this problem for the same two-level multi-level indexed allocation is asking us what is the actual size of the file that contains only 1 byte. So recall, because this is a two-level indexed allocation, we will have this first level inode, and this inode will have pointers to the second level index blocks. So we'll at least need one second level index block here, and then this second level index block will point to at least one block which will contain this 1 byte of data. Note that even if you want to store just 1 byte of data on a file in the hard disk, you must allocate at least one block of space, because that's the smallest granularity that we can read and write from the hard disk. So for storing this 1 byte of data, we need one data block which will occupy 1 kilobyte of space. We would, for any file, regardless of how much actual space or how much actual data it contains, we must allocate at least this one initial inode, which will again be 1 kilobyte or 1 block. And in this case, because it is a two-level multi-level indexed allocation, we need at least one more index block here at level 2. So this will also occupy 1 kilobyte. So a total of 1 plus 1 plus 1, 3 kilobyte space would be occupied on the hard disk, even for storing just 1 byte of data under this scheme. An alternative hybrid approach to the multi-level indexed approach is used in Unix file system in the form of Unix inode. So this block over here is a logical representation of a Unix inode. On top here we have some meta information related to the file. So inode basically stands for the index node. So this meta information would contain information, for example, the owners of the file, some relevant timestamps, for example, when the file was created or when it was last updated, and so forth. Next, here we have a bunch of pointers. So to be precise, we have 15 pointers. The first 12 of these are the first 12 pointers. These 12 pointers they point to the direct blocks. So what that means is they contain addresses of blocks that contain data of file. So note that these first 12 pointers, they are directly pointing to data blocks. So what that means is if the file is small, so by small we mean the file has no more than 12 blocks, then for such small files we do not need any separate index blocks. All the pointers to up to first 12 data blocks of the file can be contained inside this inode. So if assuming that the block size is 4 kilobyte, uh, up to first 12 blocks can be directly accessed from the inode. So if the file of size up to 4 into 12 48 kilobyte, this can be accessed directly. Now after this, the last three pointers here in the inode, these point to indirect blocks, but they are not all the same. The first pointer over here points to a single indirect block, so which is an index block containing not data but the addresses of blocks that do contain data. So essentially this is a pointer to another index block. So this is the index block, and inside this index block we have pointers that point to actual data. So this is single indirect index block. The second pointer here is the double indirect block. So this double indirect entry, this contains the address of a block. So this contains this address of this block that contains addresses of other blocks that contain pointers to the actual data block. So there is two level of indirection over here. So this double indirection is pointing to a block that contains the addresses of blocks that contain pointers to the actual data blocks. So likewise, this last pointer over here, this contains the address of a triple indirect block. In the Unix operating system, every file has an inode or an index node associated with it. Every inode has a unique inode number. In the Unix based operating systems, if you want to retrieve the inode number of a given file, you can simply use this command ls-i with the file name. So this will print the inode number. You could also use the stat file name command. So note that this is stat file name, it will print the inode number, but together with this it will also print a bunch of other information. Now in general, by default an inode would be stored somewhere on the hard disk. When you open a file for reading or writing, the associated inode would be copied from the hard disk into the main memory.